Welcome to the Ty Beal Show, where we discuss food, science, and life. I'm Ty Beal, a scientist at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, or GAIN. My guest today is Calley Means, co-founder of Truemed and New York Times #1 best-selling author of Good Energy. Calley Means is also a senior advisor to the White House on MAHA, or Make America Healthy Again. In our conversation, we discuss how to make America's children healthy again and truly transform our food system to address the root cause of chronic disease. A quick note before we start. This podcast is separate from my role at GAIN. Okay, let's dive in. Calley Means, welcome to the show.
Oh, great to be here.
All right, so you're a senior advisor to the White House and a key leader in the Make America Healthy Again movement. Early in your career, you consulted for Coke to ensure sugar taxes failed and soda was included in food stamp funding. So what led you to become one of the fiercest opponents of the corporate capture of our food supply and a strong advocate for policies now like removing soda from SNAP?
Yeah, that was 15 years ago when I was in DC as a consultant for some of these large food companies. And that just is what you did. I mean, I thought I was doing the right thing, helping these companies combat overregulation. I've been out of that for more than a decade. And I think what's happened is first principle thinking that we're really sick. And I just look at always the comparisons between the US and other countries. I think we live 7 years less than the Italians. We have like 4 or 5 times higher childhood obesity rates than other countries, much higher childhood diabetes, cardiology issues, depression. All of these issues are going up all at once. And, reflecting on it with the tremendous help of my sister, who really got me on this path because she was, the Stanford med school student, surgeon who left the system, really helped open my eyes. I thought she was crazy at first. But it was really this first principles question of like, why are Americans so sick? Are we innately want to be sick? Do we innately want to be obese? And, a huge proportion of US adults being diabetic. Well, I don't think so. I don't see that. I don't see people wanting that. So there's got to be an incentive problem. And that was kind of where I used my experience growing up in DC and just thinking about the incentives and, remembering those rooms and what I've seen in DC. These generally aren't bad people, but they convince themselves through money, through incentives, that in the case of food, making food cheaper, getting government recommendations for those foods, getting government incentives for those foods, really pushing addictive cheap food onto Americans, onto kids is what their bottom line is based on.
Yeah.
And over decades, we have, nutrition guidelines, in many cases, including going back to the food pyramid that recommend, processed starches, processed grains, sugar in many cases to kids. It's kind of underlied this issue even to this day. The nutrition guidelines haven't taken a stance on ultra processed food. Those recommendations go into incentives. So you look at the SNAP program, food stamps is $120 billion. I think the majority of that goes to ultra processed food, and the top item is soda. And then, the nutrition guidelines go into school lunches. At school lunches, by some measures, it's 70% ultra processed food. And then, that the people go back and forth on that definition, but it's probably not great. We want whole food on a child's plate. You look at military food, it's not great. You look at wherever government procures food, recommends food, we've kind of lost our way. So
Hospitals,
yeah. Exactly. So you don't have health authorities really pounding the pavement on simple principles about what I think is really important, just whole food. You just start there. And then you have a ton of incentives going into, kind of our ultra processed food paradigm, which if you look at the disparities between other countries, where 70% of a child's diet in the United States are ultra processed food, and it's 10 to 20% in many European countries. So that, I think, clearly led to the chronic disease crisis that we have. And then my narrative and my thesis is that the medical system's kind of turned a blind eye to the underlying cause of chronic disease and is really predicated on accepting that we have chronic disease and then creating pills and medical interventions to manage, not reverse or prevent. So that's the overarching framework my sister and I, created. I think a lot of people are coming to that conclusion. We tried to give voice to it. And I think the two things that are happening now is I think the most important is that there's a cultural awakening where people are asking more questions about what they're buying and eating. And then we're trying to knock out policy reform to chip away at those incentives.
Yeah, well said. I mean, it's hard to notice how wealthy the U.S. is and how awful our health is. I mean, you look at Italy, France, Japan, right? Much lower rates of chronic disease, obesity, much lower consumption of these sort of junk foods or the ultra processed foods. And when you talk about schools, we both have kids. Mine are in school, and it's pretty hard to see what's there, what sort of fits through the guidelines, even if it's sort of a whole grain. It's like 51% whole grain cinnamon rolls with 49% refined carbs and added sugar, right? It's just, it doesn't really make sense. Okay, so you also started a company called Truemed. Can you tell us just a little bit about that for those who aren't aware?
Yeah, that came out of the same type of thesis, which is, when you look at where we spend money in the country, 6% of our national income goes to food and 23% goes to healthcare. And in 1940, we used to spend 25% of our national income on food and 3% on healthcare. And then in many countries in Europe, they spend double per capita the amount we do on food and then much less on healthcare, 3 to 4 times less per capita on healthcare. So I think we have a fundamental incentive problem where we're much more slanted to the healthcare system, basically cleaning up the mess of our metabolic dysfunction. So what Truemed does is it finds compliant ways for people who are struggling with chronic disease or trying to prevent chronic disease to steer their medical dollars to metabolically healthy items, including food. So if you have a letter of medical necessity, if your doctor actually outlines a dietary plan or an exercise plan to, reverse diabetes or prediabetes or obesity or even depression, you can use your tax advantage HSA, FSA dollars on those items tax-free with medical dollars. So that's what our company helps enable.
Yeah, I mean, it makes perfect sense to spend money preventing disease than afterwards trying to treat it.
It's very simple.
It's not a super complicated thing. Okay, let's get into how to make our children healthy again. I think this is something we both care a lot about. We look at prediabetes in the U.S. Kids, it's more than doubled in the past decade. I think it's now more than 1 in 4 kids, 12 to 19, are pre-diabetic. We see increasing rates of obesity and overweight. So 1 in 3 when you're in first grade, 1 in 2 by the time you're in 4th grade, and then 3 in 4 adults now are overweight or obese, which is just, the vast majority. And, in this recent MAHA report on children, we saw kind of 4 tenets. We saw, let's focus on poor diet, chemical exposure, lack of physical activity and chronic stress, and over-medicalization. So can you explain the vision for how do you sort of make these tenets a reality?
Totally. So, I think it's funny because when you I've certainly expected this and have seen this, so you get into the political system, it becomes very toxic, and there's a lot of press is saying the MAHA initiative is anti-science, and a lot of barbs back and forth. But this report from the government really, I think, outlines something that's unimpeachable. Those items, food, movement, environmental toxins, chronic stress. These are like really important areas that are pretty unimpeachable, I think pretty bipartisan. So I do think it was important that the government actually, in a report, I joke like this report basically pissed off every single interest group and big area of the U.S. economy. We talked about screen time. We talked about pesticides. We talked about vaccines. We talked about pharmaceutical products. We talked about, food, ultra processed food, basically but it's not a finger pointing or a tisk. I just think, and I'll tell you, every CEO and every lobbyist I meet with, they can't really argue with this fact that we've clearly lost our way a little bit. It's not that these chemicals that have been introduced or even ultra processed food innovations or cell phones, are bad things that we should ban. But they clearly, this incredible rate of change has impacted our metabolic health. So I do think one of the most important things we're doing is starting to open up a conversation, again, where we can use that $5 trillion from the medical system that we now spend on sick care to actually ameliorate and better understand the impact of these modern conveniences are having on our health. So that we came up with a strategy report, which we released recently that came from that initial assessment. And I think a lot of it starts with actually the NIH and research. I really think the NIH personally has lost its way over the past 20 years. Francis Collins, his big initiative was understanding the genome and genetics. I mean, not that that's not important, but really when we look at American health and the fact that we spend 90 to 95% of our budget on chronic disease, there might be some genetic components, but clearly there's external factors. And there has not really been, I would say, there's practically been no effort at the NIH to really understand the external causes that are leading to the chronic disease crisis. Again, there's so many barbs in the media, but I think it's really a good example and a very important that the NIH recently, said we're going to figure out the external causes of autism, turn over every stone. They have $50 billion of research funding going into that. They're investigating 30 different hypotheses. I think some of this is kind of obvious in a way. I think a lot of, chronic disease and the research is going to show it is tied to our food. And I think my suspicion is it boils down to simple principles that we all know. But I do think creating the scientific underpinning for that, and really elucidating and having real scientific substantiation for the external causes of disease, that then bleeds into culture and it eventually bleeds into medical reimbursement, essentially. And that's another thing we point out. So it's that kind of going along the chain. The NIH, I think a fundamental reset there is really important. At the FDA, I really just think and we're doing this, just getting the corporate capture out of the FDA and really looking at the incentives there. It's not that therapeutics are bad, but I do think the culture at HHS that I've seen, it's just we have this overarching acceptance that we're sick and we just need to, find the next drug to manage that condition. I think the FDA has allowed a lot of problematic things like they're able to be paid by the pharma industry, which is the majority of their budget. They've been pretty lax on disclosures for patients. We're taking strong action against pharmaceutical ads, which I really think disrupt the doctor-patient relationship. So it's really just foundational incentive change there. And then CMS, which is the largest part of the entire federal government, the budget, which really sets the standard of care for both Medicare and Medicaid and private insurance. As this research and lack of corporate conflict hopefully changes the culture, we really do have to have a hard conversation about what our standard of care is. I think it's really problematic, and it talks about this in the report, that the way our insurance is paid out is really dictated by the American Medical Association and various specialty groups like the American Academy of Pediatrics, which have really been co-opted. I mean, the American Medical Association is really problematic, big conflicts. I've completely lost faith in the American Academy of Pediatrics, and they're literally a pharmaceutical front group if you look at their funding. So as we have this new research, we need to really think about a new paradigm for, I think, how medical care for chronic disease is conducted. Doctors don't learn nutrition often in medical school. Maybe a patient's told to eat healthy, but we're not incentivizing and really ingraining into our standard of care any type of real nutrition intervention. So that's a long-term journey, but that's really what we've outlined as the steps.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I think I sort of took away from there these four sort of, I guess, strategies of advancing research, like you mentioned, realigning these incentives, working, I'm not quite sure how it happens, but fostering this private sector collaboration where you can actually reduce the influence in a negative way, but still work with industry, right? Like, how do you sort of get them to come to where they need to be? Because I think everyone who works in these industries, everyone who works here, I mean, everyone has family members. You have children. Most people, we're aware that chronic diseases are a disaster. It's like, how do we change our mindset?
Well, I find that the engagement with industry, which I've been doing a lot of, is really interesting because, as I said, when you meet with really anyone from these large corporations that impact our health, they all agree on the 10-year place we want to get to, which is a world where the kids are healthier. And
Thankfully.
they truly do want that. And they also truly acknowledge there is a problem right now. Some people get mad at me or Secretary Kennedy for meeting with these companies that people feel have caused a lot of harm. And I do think they've caused a lot of harm. But I also think it's been a joint effort with the government, with various actions by companies, with a lot of different things over 30 years. Much of this is people we're talking to weren't even responsible for. We have a broken system where there's a lot of fingers to point at.
And think about this: we have to get our food from somewhere.
Yeah,
right?
I try to have. When you look at the pharmaceutical industry, look at the big food industry, look at the pesticide industry, a lot of these companies did start with good intentions, and a lot of these companies do provide vital services. I mean, our agriculture system as currently constituted can't exist without chemicals. We've used various types of crop protection tools and insect and weed repellents, for a long time. It's led to, our agriculture practices have led to where all of human history has been an issue with starvation to now it's a different problem. So you can you got to have, I think it's important to have some empathy. The other thing I'd say is these industries are like today, the backbone, for better or worse, the backbone of the U.S. economy. They employ tens of millions of people, produce trillions of dollars of economic growth. That is obviously a factor as you engage in these conversations. What I think is different is that we have behind our backs, I would call a voter mandate to have these tough conversations.
Yeah.
And I'll give some examples. So when I talk to the pharmaceutical industry, they're actually a little bit frustrated where they tell me, and one of the most interesting conversations I've had with a large company's CEO is that they're playing by the rules of the game. And the rules of the game are essentially to create incremental management techniques for chronic disease. They said if the entire structure for our reimbursement, and our incentive was to create longevity drugs or real cures, and we were paid for that, that would be what we would develop. And it's pretty just basic, but like they go to where the incentives are, and that's where the incentives are. So we're basically trying to create a 10-year bridge to where therapeutic and pharmaceutical companies aren't just rewarded for managing disease, but actually, incentivized and rewarded for things that actually prolong life and prolong thriving and cure disease. So they're not incentivized to cure things right now. So that's an interesting back and forth. On the food industry and, big food, they'll attack us as being anti-science with their press releases, but they absolutely acknowledge there's a real problem. They acknowledge there's differences between our food and European food. They do not dispute that there's an issue with children eating too much ultra-processed food. They can't even defend what's happening right now, to be honest. And we don't want these companies to go away, but we want a market force revolution and people demanding healthier food. And we want, ideally, our food to have less chemicals, that particularly ones that have been proven to be potentially harmful to kids. Less sugar, healthier food. Now, it's interesting, the food companies are actually, well before MAHA, are actually seeing that consumer pull. Actually, the large processed food companies have been doing very poorly. Their stocks have been down, before MAHA. So they actually are responding to consumer demand. So, I think Pepsi, 50% of their revenues from low calorie, no calorie drinks. I mean, they're dramatically shifting their product mix. Food companies are doing lower sugar, higher protein products. They're advertising and really promoting that they're taking various chemicals out. So because of the political force we have in the market pull, I think it's been really positive, but we've had, I think, 60% of the U.S. food supply voluntarily remove artificial dyes. Now, I don't think artificial dyes are like the end-all be-all. I don't think it's the silver bullet. I think it's important. I do think it's important. I mean, I think it's not probably a great thing for 60% of children's food to have petroleum-based food dyes. I think there is some concerning research on it. But I do think it's a very powerful example where this doesn't really make sense. And we've had just yesterday, Walmart and their private label brand, which is actually one of the biggest food companies in the country, they're totally taking food dyes out of their supply chain. So I think we'll see a lot more of that I think is very positive.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's like these nudges, you can be criticized. He's like, oh,
right.
What is food guy? What is that going to do to the overall economy? It's like, come on, like we have to take things a step at a time. You can't just overnight just transform it. I think you also, in this report, there's also this idea of increasing public awareness. So I think there's that, maybe the demand side of it too, where that can play a role. It's all related. I think you're absolutely right about the business case or the economic case. Like you have to change the incentives to have it actually work out to be viable, to produce, prevention, help people be healthy, not just treating diseases. Do you have an example of? I mean, you mentioned some, but what are some of the key successes? Because you've been moving fast, that you've sort of been able to achieve this far.
Well, yeah, I think you do have critics. A lot of the critics in the kind of influencer / academia world say, "Oh, it's just about food dyes," or those type of criticisms. It's such a bad faith argument that I think people see through and will continue to see through, because I don't think anyone would even argue when you list what has happened last year. I think it's been the most significant reforms and improvements to public health, particularly around food, in modern American history. So in 1 year, we're going to have transformative nutrition guidelines coming out this year, which finally end the legacy of the food pyramid, which we still live under, which essentially denigrated protein in many ways, had grains at the base of the pyramid, didn't really make a differentiation between whole grains or processed grains, demonized fats in some way and healthy fats. So we're going to have real change to that, which is hopefully going to have a profound impact on culture and have a big impact on what schools can buy and military and other SNAP, other programs can buy. Number two, we have worked to dramatically reform SNAP, which is a really important program 15% of the U.S. population depend on. We've worked with 30 states to remove soda and candy from SNAP. That's a huge deal. That's tens of billions of dollars of government money that was going to soda companies and candy companies. Now, is that everything? No, but I think it's actually a very important win against special interests, because Coca-Cola alone gets $4 billion a year from the federal government on SNAP. They were fighting this hard, but we've won that, and I think it's going to have a significant improvement to health among people on SNAP. We have started a process that we've announced that's going to be done next year on front of pack food labeling. This is really important for transparency. We're going to have much bolder food labels. People have been talking about this for over a decade, both parties. It's just been dragged along. We're going to get that done. We're working and have a public comment period and working with many stakeholders on a definition finally in the U.S. for ultra-processed food. That's probably a big debate among researchers, and it's kind of always just a discussion. I think when we have that, we're going to really be able to, at least be speaking the same language, and it'll have some, downstream impacts that are very important. I think what I'm most proud of is that there is a consumer awakening happening where people are reading labels more, people are paying more attention to their food. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's impressive. I think it's not just at the national level, but as you said, the states, I think that wouldn't have happened without this movement. I think that's pretty clear. It hasn't happened before. And, in our state, there's been policy to basically drastically redo school meals. Right?
We're really proud of that. I've been working with the leadership in Arizona. I just got back yesterday from a conference of including leaders from Arizona, of state leaders. 30 states in the past year have passed bills to improve school lunches, to improve transparency with food, to improve SNAP. It's really, that's in close coordination with the federal government, and I think it's really positive.
It's really cool to see. A lot of these are actually bipartisan. You actually see, and I think for the first time we've seen at the Senate, people mentioning the word ultra-processed foods. I don't think that would have happened before. So that's pretty awesome to see. I think it's a no-brainer to me that you said the highest actual consumption in SNAP, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, where lower income consumers can get access to, going to the grocery store, is soda.
Right.
So banning that makes a lot of sense. It's not saying you can't have soda. It's saying we're not going to fund purchases of soda,
Right. Exactly.
right? With taxpayer dollars. Yeah. Okay. So we've seen a lot of movement in the States. We've seen a lot of movement at the national level. What are the big challenges that you've sort of faced, and what do you sort of have to overcome?
Yeah, I think what's most surprising, or what's most pronounced, is the information environment that I think almost guarantees any discussion of reforming these large systems that employ so many people and are responsible for trillions of dollars is going to be toxic. So a lot of people are like, why can't this be more bipartisan? Why can't this be more positive? Why does Secretary Kennedy have to talk about, vaccines or this issue or that issue? It's like, if we were executing perfectly, it would be just as toxic, because the media is 50% funded by pharmaceutical companies, and a lot of it's from food companies. The pharmaceutical companies are the top donator to um, politicians themselves.
Wow.
Politicians themselves. The Senate, Bernie Sanders said to Secretary Kennedy recently, he's like, how can you say we're all bought off by pharma and everything's corrupt? And he's like, every single senator here is paid by pharma, because he was criticizing Bernie. He's like, you're saying I've taken millions from pharma. I looked at the numbers. Every person here except 99 senators taken like over $500,000 from pharma. He's like, well, that's the point. He was trying to argue that like it's so normalized. How can this be a problem?
Yeah.
So you got toxicity from the Senate. You've got toxicity from the media. And then, this is what I used to do 15 years ago, but it's still the case. You've got these companies, secretly paying a ton of people to muddy the waters and make this really toxic. In the room, I'm just watching Secretary Kennedy at the highest levels talk about getting healthier food for kids, talking about doing, just research, basic research on things like, pharmaceutical products and vaccines. Getting more exercise for kids. I mean, it's very positive.
A lot of them are common sense things
there's
that most
that's
people would
really
say,
what we're
look,
focused on.
yeah.
It just is what we're focused on. And I've just kind of, it's not surprising, but it's just so pronounced how promoting that message of asking questions about why our kids are sick and, what we can do to change, it's just amazing how that elicits such a violent reaction,
A defensive response.
and a defensive
kinda.
reaction.
Yeah.
And then people say, oh, and I would just ask anyone who's kind of on the fence to consider, they say, well, couldn't you guys do it a little better? Couldn't you be less toxic? It's like, there's zero way to take on these industries without it being toxic. Like, I'm convinced of that. No matter how perfect
it's going to be
do.
messy no matter what. And a lot of people, I think, in this area just want to know the truth. And there's so much funding from industry, and that usually influences the study and the researchers. And so I think we really need this, this more balanced approach where ultimately we can look at things critically and not be afraid to ask questions. It's not, it should not be surprising that we have a lot of issues with our health, especially the kids. Right?
Well, what do you see in the academic community from, there's clearly not a lot of, is it all cynical? Do they have any good points in their criticism? What do you think?
The thing is, there's not a lot of interacting. It's polarized. And I think that's a shame. Like, this is sort of what happens in academia. You have the scientists that they all agree about something and they kind of work on their paper together and they put it out. And then you have the other scientists on another side of an issue and they agree and they work, right? And I think that that's a shame, because there's actually usually good points made by people on different sides of issues, but they're missed because of polarization, because of maybe egos, maybe there's the politics of it. And I think it's a shame. Like, what we need more of, I think, is trying to bring people with differing perspectives together. For example, if I work on a paper, I was invited to write a paper on sort of, animal products, vegan, vegetarian type foods. I specifically reached out to people who had a different perspective, who are kind of experts in the vegan plant-based side of things, because I knew, like, I'm going to be coming at this from my angle, and I'm probably going to produce a better paper, more balanced, if I can include these different perspectives. Doesn't mean we agree about everything, but there's actually a lot of progress and growth if you can respectfully debate, you can examine things. And I think that's what's still needed here. I think it's like you're saying, it's hard to it's hard to be blamed for everything, right? If there's sort of no openness to look in and examine things that are sort of dogma or long held beliefs, right? Of just sort of a blind, nope, this is the way it is. We're not going to touch that.
Yeah, I think we're speaking past each other. A lot of groups are speaking past each other. I mean, when I talk to people in academia or, people on the field in medicine, it's like, well, you're demonizing us, or, well, you need to be more nuanced. It's like, well, we're playing in the political arena and you can't do that. I mean, we're trying to put together a political coalition here, by making a really clear argument. And I do believe the argument at the highest level is true, which our system has lost its way. It's not demonizing or denigrating any one person or saying that academia needs to go away. It's actually, I really see this. It's how do we actually get the shackles out of the way to have a flourish of research. Secretary Kennedy is never telling anyone what the results should be. I really actually do think there's a desire at the NIH, and it's very messy, but to really unleash academic freedom and unleash, real cross collaboration, and empower research to boldly explore answers to really important root cause questions and really messy questions. So I really think it's positive. But I think, I guess it's understandable how some fields would see all this as an attack and reflexively want to defend themselves. What I would argue, though, is, understand the impetus of where this political animation is coming from. And I do think there should be some humility in various sectors of like what voters are trying to say, which is that there's something a little bit wrong. And that really does give license to have some long-term conversations about how we can reform. And what frustrates me sometimes is the just complete reflexive, and I would call lack of humility from some quarters to not even engage in that conversation or admit that there's a valid reason that Americans have questions about what's happening. Some folks, still just, I'm sure in academia, just, it's just total misinformation, whack jobs. It's like, no, there's something that's being said. It's the same thing with President Trump. I mean, people have been trying to, kind of denigrate him, his followers for a long time. But it's like, it's been 10 years. It's been 10 years and voters keep trying to say something. Can we have some compassion and some empathy for what those voters are trying to say in a good faith way? And what I think they're trying to say is there's real frustration in this country about our big institutions. And I think that fundamental argument, and I think the foundation of what the voters, I believe, are trying to say is right. It's messy though. And that's to me what's inspiring about what's happening in the administration right now. There's no easy answers. We know that. The fact that these conversations are even happening and we're able to talk to pharma, able to talk to academia, and there's some tough conversations there, we're able to talk to, the food industry, the agriculture industry, pesticide industry. I think the fact that we're having these conversations led by this political movement is really actually positive, but it is messy.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I think it's really challenging for people to, I think, engage in these, challenging the status quo. I think there's a lot of power and peer pressure, even if you think about the scientific community, to just sort of go along with all of these agencies and bodies that have sort of been sort of accepted as fact. I feel the pressure too. I feel, don't question certain things. And that's kind of like what my nature is, sort of curiosity. It's sort of like questioning the status quo. I'm naturally a skeptical person, and I want to examine things and ask questions. And I think that sometimes gets me into trouble. Ultimately, though, we need to challenge the status quo. I mean, if you think about scientific findings, like most of them are wrong, and they're proven like later. It's like we can't just assume that we know all the answers. I think that's right. Okay, I'm sure we could talk a lot more about all the politics. You also wrote a book, kind of a successful book here with your sister Casey, #1 New York Times bestseller called Good Energy. I listened to it when it first came out, and I always try to listen to books so I can walk around and get some movement. And I really appreciated how you sort of avoid the diet wars. You leave room for more plant-based or more animal-based approaches. Can you tell us, just for people who haven't read it or listened to it, what are the key messages and implications of the book?
Yeah, the foundational thesis is that our entire medical paradigm, and the first chapter of the book is my sister at the end of medical school choosing between one of 42 specialties to devote her entire life to, isn't really equipped for chronic disease. Siloing disease into, where with my sister, she was doing sinusitis surgeries as a head and neck surgeon and wasn't trained and wasn't really empowered to ask why her patients with sinus inflammation inevitably had, 5, 6, 7 other comorbidities, and we're seeing an endocrinologist and a cardiologist and a psychiatrist and many other issues, kidney issues, and how that model of one patient seeing those 7 specialists with siloed care plans and siloed drugs was really wrong for this moment where there's a really base of that tree that many of these patients are facing, which is the base is metabolic dysfunction, inflammation and oxidative stress and other factors that are happening in our body. And the branch, they see a lot of branches on that tree. And I think that's what's happening in this country, where we're really tending to the branches with every single chronic disease going up, but not really understanding the base. So the book's about, having more curiosity for the, base external factors in our country that are impacting, our chronic disease rates, with a lot of, common sense tips for the reader to take more empowerment over their own health, and a call to action for the system to move more to an interconnected view of the body and chronic disease, which to me is what the whole goal of this moment is. So my sister and I wrote that shortly after my mom died, and we talk about that in the book, and it kind of led us on this path to surprisingly getting involved in the political process.
Wow, what a transformation. I'm sure you probably didn't predict that series of events happening.
No.
Well, I'm a big fan of the book. I encourage people to read it or listen. Okay, so just to wrap up, I mean, if you sort of think about what this administration is trying to do with MAHA, Make America Healthy Again, especially focused on children, but what are the biggest obstacles? What would you like to see at the end of this 4 years? Like, where would you like the situation to be?
So I think I see it in terms of a 10-year journey. So in 10 years, I'd like the spending on medicine and the $5 trillion we spend on medicine to be incentivizing hospitals to have, less full beds rather than more full beds, and pharma companies to prioritize longevity and disease curing instead of just disease management, and insurance companies to be incentivized for patients to be healthy, which they're not right now. I'd like to see a revolution in our respect and connection to our food and our farmers, and dramatically decreased consumption of ultra-processed food and more consumption of whole food. Again, not getting into dietary philosophies, but I think if you're on a whole food journey, it's going to end in some good things. I'd like to see a much more personalized healthcare system that goes to a root cause interconnected view of the body before going to pills. Okay, so that's the 10-year journey, which is really, I think, a foundational realignment in our healthcare system and our agriculture system, it's about 35% of the U.S. economy. So that's a lot. What I want to see in the next 2 to 4 years, frankly, is that this political movement stays together. What's leading to this conversation is the fact that voters are voting on chronic disease. And I want to see this voter coalition make their voices heard in the midterm election. What I think is going to happen, quite frankly, is the thesis of this movement is correct. I mean, in my opinion, I'm correct, but that's maybe not surprising. But I think this foundational 10-year vision, most people don't disagree with. And they don't disagree with that there's bad incentives in our system and these foundational things. So if this political movement can stay together, I think it's going to become more bipartisan. And frankly, the two parties are going to fight over who's more MAHA, because I do think a lot of voters are getting frustrated by that. So that's where you're an academic and know much more about these issues than me. I'm trying to continue the political momentum of this movement, because I'm honestly somewhat agnostic to even what gets done when. I want to continue to deliver wins to this movement, the dietary guidelines being a huge one, to continue really giving license to the conversation, showing momentum to the political popularity of this dynamic. So in 4 years, in 2028, I hope that this is still a primary conversation in American politics. I mean, that's honestly what I see as my main goal, guys.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think there's sort of a simplicity. I mean, a few things here to just reiterate. Simplicity of looking at the body as a whole, right? Not just going to specialists for very sort of treatment-oriented goals. Looking at how do you prevent the root cause. So there's sort of simplicity of let's eat a variety of minimally processed whole foods, reduce or minimize ultra-processed foods. There's a lot of steps to get there. We're at like 60% of the population, maybe 70% of youth and children consuming ultra-processed foods. We have an obesity and chronic disease epidemic. It's not going to change overnight.
Right.
What you're doing and you're working towards is, I think, a lot of things that are sort of probably wouldn't be so controversial if it wasn't our political environment. But it's like, let's have kids eat healthier, move more, look at screens less. Let's work on addressing healthy lifestyles and not just spending all this money treating disease. Let's shift the incentives, right? And I think the states are showing that leadership. Arizona's one, Texas, Michigan, California, I mean, number of states, right? And I think that is probably going to be lasting. The challenge will be, how do you maintain this momentum and not have backsliding? But I think, as you're saying, if this is something that the voters and the population in general agrees with and is behind, regardless of if there's a change in, if it's a democratic leadership change, hopefully that the overall population sort of has that, sort of adopts that and realizes, okay, I want my kids to be healthy. I want my neighbor, I want my family, I want my parents
the cultural
to be
awakening, guys, most important.
Yeah, and that I see it happening. I think it's impressive, and I'm inspired. So, all right, Calley Means, thank you so much for joining me. Appreciate it.